Ladies and gentlemen, my mission is to help players rated 2000 plus get to 2200 plus, and in this video I will show you my breakthrough tournament that got me from being stuck around 2150 to going over 2200 FIDE rating and surging to a national rating of over 2300 when just a year ago I was stuck below 2000. So would you like to know how I did it? Not just the games that I played in this breakthrough tournament, the 2008 Australian Championship, but some of the training techniques I used as well to get that advantage and have such a breakthrough performance? Well, if so, you're in the right place, and I'm going to share with you some of the key moments from this tournament, the 2008 Australian Championship, which of course I prepared quite seriously for, more seriously than for any tournament in my life. The first element I have to really attribute to my success is that I wasn't doing everything on my own, but I did have some help as well. I remember that in about April 2007 onwards, I started working with the top Australian Grandmaster, Ian Rogers, and that learning from a Grandmaster and getting that better understanding really helped me to be able to outplay many high-rated players in the tournament. And this first game was one that I played with the white pieces against the FIDE master at the time, Igor Goldenberg, very solid player, also a coach himself. In fact, I remember 1 year after this tournament, he had his own breakthrough tournament, getting his final International Master Norm Queenstown 2009, and I actually got to congratulate him in person there, which was nice. So he was already IM strength, basically, at 2395 FIDE, and, well, it is sort of unlucky that he sort of went into exactly the system that was my strongest one at the time, which is the Shabalov Shiroslav with G4. I had a book actually just on this system and knew all of the finer points and details. And also another secret advantage that I had is that I had played this variation in tens and tens of blitz games on Internet Chess Club. Of course, I didn't have chess.com so strongly back at that time, so ICC was like next best thing. And okay, I sort of knew that my opponent should have played 8-6, with the idea of playing DC4 and B5 and the whole Maran plan you see in the Semi-Slav at a later time. But he went DC4, and I will say that even though I didn't get a great outcome from the opening, admittedly I didn't play this position very well, I still managed to get a big time advantage on the clock where my opponent was playing good moves but spending a lot of time to play them. Immediately after E5 and G5, I think that this position is quite a lot better for white, yeah, because the knight on G4 is sort of a little bit stuck and doesn't have so many great squares, and after H3 I definitely was able to show a very nice advantage. I do realize I'm going through the game quite quickly, but that's just because I want to get to a critical moment later. But I mean, at this point I basically have a winning position, although I guess here the fact that my opponent was a much stronger player than me at the time objectively started to come into play, because like at this point I play F4 with opening preparation I basically got a totally winning position out of the opening essentially. But then I started to misplay it and started to lose control, where my opponent ended up doing some exchange sack, I remember, where, he got this really great initiative and actually was probably winning, in fact, at one point from memory. When we analysed it afterwards as well, which was, very also sporting of my opponent, because a lot of players, when they lose a game to a much lower rate player, like, they just are so distraught that they just don't want to look at the game. I know I definitely fit into that category, yeah. But, he actually wanted to look at it afterwards and learn, so it showed a great wisdom from him in that sense. And it also helped me as well, to analyse with a stronger player and get his perspective on some of the things that I, didn't understand in the game as well. I mean, now, you have engines. It's all very, say, well, just turn on the engine on and it'll give you the answer. But there's still a important element of understanding, like, why the move was a mistake or, what was the better move. And also what to actually need to see in order to make that better move work in a game. Like, these are things that, require a bit more effort, yes, to learn. But that's where the greatest improvement comes from our games. So anyway, okay, because I don't want this video to be like 11 hours long, so this is going to be more just very briefly going through each game, but just from this you can already see just how much of a difference it makes when you really don't just play an opening like I'm just going to just play it and make it up from, I don't know, let's say you play to London, okay, I play Bishop F4 on move 2 and I make it up from there. Yeah, that might work if you're, let's say, just starting out in chess, but, if you're serious about becoming a chess expert or chess master or beyond, yeah, you have to, put the effort in and, of course, to make sure that you know some of the finer points of the opening as well, even beyond, let's say, just what the theory is. But yeah, you can see how like I put a lot of pressure on my opponent. I prepared this very dangerous g4 idea he was not so ready for, and it allowed me to get a winning position within, let's say, 15 to 17 moves against a player who was just way stronger than me at the time, but I was a little bit lucky, let's say. In any case, moving on to the next game in round 2, well, I was excited. I was on 1 out of 1. I'm like, okay, I'm playing as black against Greg Canfell, FIDE Master Raid 2315, and the psychological mistake I had at the time is I thought, okay, I beat a 2395 with white. Now I play someone a bit lower rated with black, so do I just go for the win and beat him, or do I just try and play solidly? And the problem is I didn't really fully commit to one strategy. I remember I kind of was trying to do a little bit of keeping the position solid, but also really trying to sort of have winning chances as well to outplay him later. But unfortunately, I didn't really have the strength for that time to execute this strategy well. And also, Greg was actually quite a difficult opponent for me. He's one of these players that, it's just very solid, but also very tactically alert at the same time. You could say almost like kind of an Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan kind of style, but in a more Australian version, if you like. So anyway, one big change that I made in the in preparation tournament, and this is one of the really biggest things I attribute to getting from 2-100, like being stuck at that 2-100-ish level to jumping to 2-250 so quickly, is that, well, I changed my openings that weren't working. You see, back when I was playing, when I was around 2000-ish, and also, like, basically since I started playing adult chess tournaments, I was playing the King's Indian more or less exclusively as my defense to 1 d4, and of course you can play it against the flank openings as well, as we see with 1 knight f3 move orders. But yeah, I was playing this, so I did dabble a little bit with 1 g6 and d6 move orders, delaying knight f6 at some point, but still quite similar to a King's Indian, yeah? But after e4 castles, the line I was really struggling with in my games was particularly the classical, and it's sort of like, every opening, I believe that there's one variation where it's like, okay, this variation is a litmus test of whether this opening is a good fit for you. If you really love playing these positions, then probably the opening is a good fit. And if not, the opening is probably not a good fit and you should play something else, yeah? So I was playing the mainline Mar del Plata with knight c6, d5, and knight e7, on the suggestion actually back in 2002 of my first private chess coach, I am John Paul Wallace, who really gave me the foundational chess understanding, you could say, to get to up to like a 1600, 1800 plus level. We stopped working before I got to it, but he laid that important strategic foundation for my understanding, as that was something he was really, really good at explaining clearly. But yeah, I had some problems where, for example, a lot of my opponents would play the bayonet, and I would play, the trendy main line with knight h5, and, these sort of things where, white tries to say that he's got moves like knight e6 at a good moment if you go h6. Like, say, if I play bishop f3 just for argument's sake, they've got moves like knight e6, and suddenly, in a lot of lines you can't really win the pawn back so easily because they have some tricks. Also have moves like c5 and suddenly they're sort of attacking your center. It's not like the typical Kings in Mar del Plata where, you have the attacking race, let's say, f5, f4, g5, g4 versus white going b4, c5, but it's a much more direct and sort of hand-to-hand combat. And some of the positions are just so much easier for white to play, and I had a lot of rather painful losses, even some against much lower rated players in these lines, because, well, they knew I was going to play this, because I didn't have any alternative systems in my arsenal. And on the other hand, well, they had prepared lines deeply, and, well, if you remember round 1, where I had that, unfair advantage against Igor Goldenberg of, having that much deeper knowledge of position, well, they were kind of doing that to me when I was playing with black, yeah? So that's why, and also for what's worth, even the lines where I did get this in, I still kind of felt like my opponents knew the positions better than me. These are still a line like I've studied so many books on it, but even today I kind of realize that these positions just honestly don't really suit my style that well. There are other lines I do a lot better with, so I kind of had that sort of understanding at some point, and, well, to be fair, I kind of already started to sense this as early as 2005, 2006. But, my coach at the time, they said, well, you should master the King's Indian first and then move on to another opening. And granted, that might have held back a little bit of my progress in the short term, but perhaps it also taught me some other skills that allowed me to play much better in the long term. So I guess, hindsight is 20/20. And anyway, my opponent played, or rather after e6, my opponent played g3. just want to play very solid King's Indian attack, and at the time I had learned from, I think, this book Dealing with D4 Deviations by John Cox, which had some quite interesting ideas. You know, this sort of B5 move where you kind of don't let white transpose to a Catalan with C4 because you're covering it with a B pawn, yeah? But the thing is that even though I'd studied a bit of the theory, you know, I'd gone through the Cox book and I knew what to do in this line in terms of theory, the thing is that I didn't really understand the positions. Okay, knight a6 is probably a little bit imprecise, to be honest. I should probably just take and play more for solid equality, but I remember I was sort of trying to really go for the win against him as well, and, well, with the black pieces, sometimes, you know, you have to equalize before you can win at least this is what Fischer used to say. I believe it was Fischer who said it. Maybe Fischer said that you said something different. But anyway, still the point kind of remains, like, you can't just win out of the opening with black in principle. At least not at this kind of level. But yeah, my opponent played bishop f4, and it was kind of like, well, I have no idea what you're meant to do against this move, but it just looks like such a natural move. So I had this kind of frustration of, well, he's playing like a good move, and I haven't studied it before, which was another psychological thing I, had a little hang-up I had at the time, that if opponent played a move that I didn't know, I would immediately look like, what is wrong with this move? Why is it not in my knowledge? When maybe it's just a case I just played a good move that wasn't in the resource I checked. So after bishop e7, queen to d3, maybe queen b3 is a better way to attack the pawn, but still I kind of maybe didn't assess the position so well, because I was reluctant to play the move c4 here, because I thought that he would just go knight d2, e4, and just take the center, and, well, I didn't have the knowledge of the Queen's Indian at the time, because if they played like c4, I was going for the Bogo Indian. This was kind of like a lazy system I was playing to allow me to kind of get the repertoire up and running quickly for the tournament. Sometimes these shortcuts can be a good idea to incorporate in your repertoire if you know you're not going to, let's say, spend thousands of hours studying semi-Slav theory as black, for example. But yeah, what I didn't know is that this idea of bishop e4, this whole concept wasn't really deeply rooted in my long-term memory. Maybe white is still a little better even here with trying to get rid of the bishop, but at least you get a somewhat solid position by holding back his e4 push. But I didn't know that, and after queen b6, he played a very good move of a4. With the idea that after takes, yeah, he sacks a pawn, but suddenly I'm a little bit behind in development and I'm not completely ready for this change in the position, and of course queen b2, rook b1 is just blundering the queen, right? But after d5, yeah, my opponent just had a pretty nice advantage. Admittedly, he probably didn't play it in the very best way, like rook a4, and then this is maybe a little bit imprecise by white. But even so, in the long term, I kind of have this problem that my a7 pawn is admittedly an isolated pawn. And it's kind of like, well, if I don't resolve this in some way and he gets the pressure on the a file, my life is just going to be very difficult, and that's kind of what happened in the game. I just made some bad strategic decisions and lost really quite convincingly. So to put this into concrete terms, I played the move bishop c5. Again, a common mistake at this 200 level and below is like this forcing-itis, where you try too hard to play forcing moves when you don't know what to do, instead of trying to play a little bit more cohesively. And, well, the reality is now after queen d3, I don't have this c5 square that I want for the knight, and, well, I mean, basically black is just strategically lost, because moves like b4, rook d a1, it's very hard to deal with this plan. Because also when the bishop's kicked away, to have bishop e3, and again, okay, I drew way too many arrows, but you sort of get the idea that, you know, this a7 pawn is kind of a big problem for black, and I didn't manage to resolve it. Whereas if I had played knight c5, just aiming to improve my worst placed piece, and really this was a thinking technique I hadn't really, you know, fully understood and appreciated at the time. Like, I knew it existed, but I hadn't really trained it. But if I had, I would have probably realized that, you know, you can castle. You can go a5, saying that, well, now my pawn is moving, and your b2 pawn maybe gets fixed a weakness at some point, and, well, position would be somewhat close to equality. So that was sort of the lesson I guess I learned from the game. I think Ian, Rogers, when we looked at it afterwards, said this sort of point as well, that, yeah, knight c5 is the right square for the knight, rather, is the right square for c5, not the bishop, as we can see. Okay, so next game I had the white pieces against player who was quite a bit high rate, Israel Yadal, 2266 rating, so about 100 points ahead of me. And yeah, it's kind of an interesting game in the sense that, he played this knight c6, which is a bit of an unusual system, of course, and after knight c3, I mean, bishop b4 is probably the best try to justify this move, but after d5, yeah, I just kind of got a good queen's gambit, and okay, granted, that time I didn't have much experience with the lines with knight c3, like I usually in general, preferred to play like CD5, bishop G5 approaches, and, you know, to be fair, I could have done that here as well. But I thought, you know, let's keep a bit more tension in the position, and I sort of, I guess, showed a little bit of courage to play something a little bit different to my usual line to try to punish his move order a little bit more, because I didn't want to help his bishop get outside the pawn chain, essentially. He went knight e4, and okay, my memory of the game is a little bit hazy, but I do remember there was this fun point later in the game. Okay, this is kind of like a sort of bad version of Alaska, but, you know, even a bad version of Alaska is still somewhat solid for black. But I remember the game went on for a really long time, and I ended up actually using some study that I did. Let's see if I can remember the example. Yeah, we got to this position. Yeah, I remember it now. Like, there's actually a lot of ways to win for white, but I remember that just before this tournament, so this tournament was played in early January 2008. At least I think it was early January. I mean, yeah, it was actually the 3rd of January this game was played, so my memory was correct, because this was a double round day. Like, round 1 was 1 day, and round 2 and 3 was like 1 day, like a double round day, as it were. Because, well, you don't want to take 3 weeks off work, yeah, if you can help it. But, yeah, in this case, I had been studying this book cover to cover on the car trip down for Christmas. So, you know, I was living in Sydney and still am it right now. But, you know, I was going down this very long car trip from Sydney to Melbourne because, well, somehow we weren't smart enough to think to just get a flight and get there in 1 hour. But I made very good use of the time where I just read this book, Van Perlo's Endgame Tactics, in, you know, pretty much read it cover to cover almost completely on the car trip. I think, you know, I read the last few pages on after arriving, and, well, I was kind of lucky because that time I wasn't getting car sick when looking down because, well, actually I didn't have glasses yet. You know, I sort of was like this, you know, looking and, you know, pretending that I was seeing and nodding and, like, just having no idea what was going on. But okay, more serious note, yeah, in the game I was able to use this study of the practical endgames, not just the theoretical endgames, but the actual practical tricks that win you games. I used that with king b5, knight b3, and, you know, I know that I have been talking a lot about the games, not really saying a lot of puzzles, so I think that this one is kind of a good example to see if you figured out yet the winning idea for white in this position. Do keep in mind it's also a good example of principle that the knights are very bad at dealing with rook's pawns, and okay, there are a lot of winning moves for white, technically speaking. I mean, if you wanted to play, let's say, a move like knight e3 or knight e5 defending the pawn, that's also good enough. I remember at the time I was a bit low on time, and I was a little nervous that he would play king b g3 and that suddenly I would have all this counterplay, and that this could be a bit of a problem. Computer just laughs and says king b4, knight king c4, we stopping knight c6 to cover the pawn, so our a pawn just queens, but at the time it was not that obvious to me, admittedly. And, you know, it's the way it is in chess, like, you only need to find one winning continuation as long as it does actually win by force, yeah? So what I did is I played the move knight to d2 in this position. Now, computer says it's not the absolute best line because apparently you can queen the pawn without giving up the knight, but I think you'll agree it's a very beautiful idea and a good example of me applying very directly the study of those endgame tactics. So after knight d2, a5, you know, if they play knight e4, I think you see the way in which we can stop the knight coming to catch the pawn. We can use the very nice principle of placing our king 2 squares diagonally from the knight. So king c6, and there is no way in a million years that the knight is catching the pawn because our king is just covering all of the entry points, as it were. My opponent played knight b3, but again, same problem, a6, and he can't stop my pawn queening because my king covers the key squares, and, you know, I went on to win a few more moves from this position. So that was this example here. It's kind of weird. For some reason, I have this, like Stockfish. I'm using the engine on my my supercomputer that I nicknamed Oracle a few years ago. But then, you know, Stockfish protests and said, you know, you're working me too hard, and I have to refresh every single time, which is kind of pain in the ass, but what can you do? So in round 4, I had the black pieces against another strong FIDE master, Igor Bielobruch. Again, also a player who was basically IM strength and actually got the IM title since then in the Oceania Zonal of 2013, which I also happened to play in. But this is a game that kind of, again, showed one of the sort of weaknesses I had and something that in hindsight I could have trained better. Because, yeah, the Nimzo Indian was my defense against 1d4, as it were. And I had looked a little bit at how to deal with the these kind of samey structures, which is the way that my opponent played it, you know, the most direct approach to play for e4 and take over the center. But I have to admit that after e3, bishop c5, so this is all pretty standard. Okay, nowadays I probably wouldn't castle as quickly, I would play to pressure the pawn faster. But then he played this move of e4. You know, I was familiar with the principle that knight e2, you go b6 and you just play to basically win the pawn, while of course also stopping them doing a bishop g5 pin, so, you know, knight e8 and... Okay, I'm going into too much detail, but you can sort of see how we can, you know, stop their pawns advancing with f5, make sure we kill the bishop, and then stabilize the king side before playing to win the pawn, as it were. But after this e4 move, yeah, I have to admit that I just really wasn't sure what I should do in this position. I kind of felt like this move is somehow not that great, but I realized that if I take on d4 and then play cd4, knight d4, well, then suddenly he's getting quite a lot of play here. You know, he can go e5, for example, and, you know, suddenly he's hitting my knight, and he's also, you know, threatening bishop h7 and queen d4, and, you know, just in principle, I felt that, based on my experience playing the Rubinstein IMSO as white for many years, that, you know, opening up the center for the bishops would be good for him. And what I didn't really understand at the time, something that I do teach to a lot of my students now, is this concept that when it comes to opening up the position, like my strategic understanding at the time was, well, the opening of the position favors the side with the bishop pair, because the bishops are generally better than in open positions than the knight, yes or yes. But what I didn't fully appreciate at that time is that actually what's more significant is that the bishop pair, if you think about it, is a long-term advantage, right? So it only really comes into play when all the pieces are developed. And one issue with e4 is that white is behind in development. So I didn't notice the idea at the time, but actually I could have played the move d5. Either immediately or after first taking on d4. It's kind of likely to transpose. Actually, maybe here this might actually be a bit more precise to play it this way now I think about it. Because I think at the time it just didn't occur to me. I think I just assumed, well, if they play e3, e5 at some moment, say here and here, I know my position is just bad. But the reality is that I have knight e4, and, you know, this pawn is coming under a lot of pressure, you know, and also at one point I have moves like queen a5 to also check the king and potentially keep the king in the center. If they go knight e2, I have moves like bishop to g4, and really the key point that makes this work is that white doesn't have f3 to break the pin, because we have a very nice tactic. If you want, you can pause the video and try to find it here. Yeah, well done if you looked at all the checks and captures. My first thought was queen h4, but g3 kind of fends it off. So that might give you the idea that if white didn't have the g-pawn to block, queen h4 just forces mate, or at least is completely winning. So bishop f3 and, you know, if they take queen h4, and okay, it's technically not forced mate, because they do have the move knight g3 to cover queen f2. But yeah, we've got the pin to win material, and, you know, black just wins, right? So, of course, white is not forced to play every one of these moves, but it's just to demonstrate the idea of black's play, and that if I had found this idea, it would have allowed me to actually get the opening advantage with the black pieces, something that, you know, I'd had previous games against Igor where we had battled in the same-ish King's Indian, or actually in the same-ish Benoni, because I was playing the c5 approach in that King's Indian, but just getting outplayed, because Igor's just a very, well, it takes to have very good strategic understanding, and was just able to outplay me a lot on technique, basically, just completely killing all of my counterplay and not giving me an easy plan to follow. And actually, it kind of beat me in a similar way in this game as well, because I thought, okay, I don't know what I meant to do in this position, so I'm just going to play a kind of safe move with date d6. Because, I mean, I wasn't playing the Hubner and IMSO at the time, but I at least knew that this was like a structure that existed, and I thought, well, okay, it's probably a worse version, but it would still be quite playable for black, was my conclusion. Thinking that having the knight on f3 instead of e2, well, of course, the knight's a lot better on e2 because you can play for an f4 break, or even, you know, play f3 like he did and be able to push the kingside pawns forward, as, you know, Magnus Carlsen has done in some recent Bullet and Blitz games. But yeah, the thing is, I was thinking, but he also gave up a tempo of a3, so I thought, well, his knight's on a better square, but he lost a tempo, so maybe it's not that bad of a deal. And what I kind of realized when I sort of started playing the game out more and we were thinking about it is I realized, okay, it's actually a much worse version. Because in a closed position, you know, giving up a tempo of a3 is not that big of a deal. But having a much more flexible structure white is a big deal. And, okay, I made some subsequent mistakes. Like, I didn't realize how important was to go, like, knight h5, play for f5, and really change the position. And as a result, I really just ended up in this little straitjacket. okay, maybe his move's not absolutely the most precise, but you can sort of see how, like, I'm just very passive. Like, if I don't have f5, you know, what is my pawn break? I can't go for b5 so easy because he just covers it and attacks the pawn. And yeah, I just got ground down. You know, I put up the best defense I could, but I did lose ultimately in 60 moves from this point, despite my best efforts. So you can sort of see, while this was a breakthrough tournament, it didn't really start out so smoothly for me, yeah? Because, well, I was on 2 out of 4, and okay, I'm still performing way above my rating. I beat 2 higher rated players with white, but I also lost these 2 games with black. So in this next game, I guess having this white piece against Gareth Charles, rated 2-180, so slightly higher rated than me at the time. I was rated 2-152. It was admittedly a little bit of a relief because I remember I was quite tired after this very long 60-move game, and I was actually remember still like being very nervous for a game. Like I sort of had some challenges with anxiety actually from late 2007. I guess one reason like I was having some challenges at school with like some of the, you know, the different kids and this sort of thing, and you know, because of this, like, this was sort of leading to some sort of anxiety issues. But that being said, even though I was very anxious, like, before this game, I was able to kind of compose myself using some of the kind of relaxation and sort of, let's say, you know, mental programming and anchoring techniques that really helped me to get my head in a good frame of mind. So, you know, I was nervous before the game, but actually, it doesn't really matter that much as long as you're focused when you sit at the board. And, you know, the fact he played the check Benoni was quite a bit of a relief for me because, well, it's just a completely rubbish opening. The engine gives a pretty clear plus 1.5-ish advantage for this line from memory. Admittedly, though, it's not because of the line I played in the game, however. But rather, it's because of the move bishop d3. Like, nowadays, people know that this have, like, h3, g4 in a kind of Makoganov King's Indian style. It stops their one idea of playing f5. They're not going to get in b5 because you're covering it too many times, and this is why strategically the check Benoni is basically close to lost. But at the time, I knew of g3 as being the main line from, I think, the ECO Encyclopedia chess openings I was using, and I kind of had enough familiarity with the position to kind of feel comfortable playing it this way, even though, admittedly, the way I played it with 92 is probably only giving a clear advantage, not, let's say, a strategically winning position. But still, it's quite nice. You know, he's going for the typical check Benoni plan, you know, bishop h6, knight g7. But okay, after this queen d2, he played this move of f5, and I think I remembered looking at this and realizing that the main line was to go knight to f6 first, in order to provoke a move like h3 to stop knight g4, and then, you know, go king h8 and try to kind of play this like King's Indian style, but getting the bishop out of the way first. And so when he played the move f5, I have to admit I really wasn't sure how to deal with this, in fact. And in the game, well, I went for his very safe move at h3, which is not the best move, but, you know, the player playing king h2 and preparing for f4 does give white a nice advantage. But of course, I should have just played the move f4 immediately, and admittedly, my great reluctance to do so was sort of definitely one of my weaknesses, not realizing that the opening of the center would just be in my favor when, you know, when I have a lead in development and space advantage and all this kind of thing. I mean, I guess intuitively, like, I sort of really should have known it, but probably I was a little bit nervous at this moment and didn't, because one weakness I had around this time actually was that if my opponent made a move that I thought was bad, I would immediately look for an outright refutation, and probably after f4 I saw some move he could play where I couldn't really refute it, so I said I'm not going to play it. Now, of course, I'm a lot wiser and a lot more, let's say, practical, rather than being trying to be a scientist every single moment. And so I realized, okay, it's not about, you know, proving scientifically that you're winning, but it's about playing the best move you can and setting some difficult questions for the opponent, as it were. So anyway, I played h3, and, I mean, I'm going to flick through this game really quickly, because I think that, you know, I didn't really handle it in the best way. Like, now, my advantage is definitely a lot lower than before, but still I was eventually able to get this maneuver with knight g5, where, you know, he was nervous about some knight coming into e6 at some point, I guess, and he played bishop g5, and okay, it was a position that, even though I wasn't, even though it wasn't, let's say, outright winning, still I was able to get kind of what I wanted with, you know, this very technical position where I got the pressure on d6, you know, his king is a bit weak, and after a long battle of 63 moves, so another long game, well, we got this ending that maybe if he plays it perfectly, he survives, but he wasn't able to to hold this very difficult position, and I was able to grind out the win by the end. Actually, the computer maybe is a little bit, I was being a little bit conservative, because now that my stockfish is finally behaving again, well, it's confirming this is just a winning position for white. But anyway, moving on to the next game, this was one with the black pieces. I was playing round 6 black against Benjamin Lazarus, a player who was similar rank to me, 150-ish, and quite a solid player. And this actually, I think, showed a little bit of my evolution as well, because I remember that the other system that gave me massive headaches as a junior player with black, along with the King's Ian line I showed you before, but it's also the Rossalimo. And, Rossalimo, I have to admit, is a very good opening, and it's probably the main reason why, even though I don't play anymore competitively, if I did, I would probably be playing d6 mainly, and some sort of knight off rather than knight c6. Mainly so that if they played a, Moscow with bishop b5, you get options like either bishop d7 if you want to play solidly, or knight d7 and, still playing a knight off style if you want to be a little more ambitious or enterprising, as it were. Like, you still can get your play, in a sense, get that in balance. But after bishop b5, yeah, just a very flexible approach for white, and actually later on, like when I was going more towards IM and GM, I found the Rossalimo to be an incredibly powerful weapon in my white arsenal for beating lower rated players. It felt like if I played it, I just felt like I was just going to win somehow. Perhaps because of my own experience losing way too much to lower rated players against the Rossalimo. And one thing to keep in mind when you do find one of these difficult systems is you don't necessarily have to give up the system entirely. Like, let's say if you stop playing knight c6 because of bishop b5, that might be a case of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. But still, what I did was I still played my line of g6 that I'd been playing before. But in the past, I was mostly playing d takes c6, and my results were quite frankly very bad. These more very close strategic positions where you have an unflexible structure, it just doesn't really suit my style in general. And so I played this more dynamic approach of bc6, which once I started playing this line starting in late 2007 when I was expanding my repertoire, and I remember Ian, of course Ian Rogers suggested this as a kind of alternative way that might suit me better, and well, his understanding of my style was right, and it was a very good judgment call of him. But of course I put my own work into the lines, and it was sort of my own initiative a bit as well, and well, after bishop g7, so I knew that the main line was to play rook to e1, and of course there's a lot of developments that have happened since I studied this line. What I had done at the time is I learned the positions with knight to h6, and I kind of didn't try to memorize all the theory, but I just kind of learned the systems and tried to understand the plans. So as after c3 castles h3, I would just play it in, let's say, the old-fashioned style, playing moves like f6 and, take, knight f7, and I would just say, okay, it's kind of like some Moscow semi-Slav you might compare it to. White's got the space, a nice space advantage, and somewhat better development, but black has got a flexible position with a bishop pair and a lot of different pawn breaks to potentially choose between, depending on white's next move. Now, merely later on, I kind of realized I didn't really enjoy these positions either, because, well, the computer actually confirms that white is actually just clearly better if he plays correctly, and this is the reason why, after h3, now the main lines are to play either the move d5 was a move that was played in some games, but now f5 is kind of the main trend instead, where instead of letting white dominate the center and leave you very, very passive, you play a bit more dynamically and try to, undermine the center and open up the position a bit for your bishops. But that's a story that, is a bit outside the scope of this video, because this line didn't really exist as a very serious try at the time. So anyway, my opponent played c3, and it was a game where I kind of got a very good position. After d4, it's sort of funny, actually, because this line with d5 that I played in the game, so it was e5, knight e4, and okay, this time bishop e3 is like now the main trend that I covered in my Attacking the Sicilian course I recorded back in 2020. But at that time, like, knight d2 was sort of a move that also, kind of existed and was sort of the more common one. And yeah, this is a line I used to have massive headaches against. Okay, to be fair, the version I struggled with was when you had bishop b5 and, where the knight was still on c6. So that was a line I struggled with, and because I kind of kept forgetting about the point that you can play queen b6 and sack a pawn in some lines. I lost so many games, actually, in, against much lower rated players on the way to 200 in junior tournaments, just because I kind of thought, okay, just remember queen b6 and you're fine. And then I'd get at the board and think, but I don't remember what to do if they try to win a pawn. And, looking back, it was kind of stupid, actually. Like, I should have just committed the line to memory, but somehow, like, I had this gift of an eidetic memory, and I sort of somehow, yeah, just didn't bother to revise anything, and it, at times cost me. I realize that sounds very contradictory, having to take memory and then kind of, would forget some line, but, like, even, like, thinking, like, with this memory, like, it doesn't work for, absolutely, I'm not, let's say, Kim Peek and, can recite every single word that I ever read, in that sense. I'm human like the rest of you guys, believe it or not. But okay, I basically the point is that I had actually looked at this line more seriously, and so I knew that, well, okay, bishop f5 is a move I had played successfully, like, back in 2003 or 2004, I think it was. I remember because actually when I was quite a lot younger, there was this other junior player, Raymond Song, okay, by the time I played this Australian Championship, he had moved over to China as such, so not in my kind of circle of competitors in that sense, by this time, but I mean, like, one of the few times I actually beat him with black, I think it was the only time I beat him with black, actually, was with this funny structure we got, where it was some really funny line, like e6, and I forgot which way I took back. I think I took back with the g-pawn. Like, it was a sort of position that objectively I think was just really bad, but somehow, like, he didn't really know what to do in the position, and was somehow able to outplay him, so it's kind of a funny sort of story, but anyway, well, I played c5, and actually this was what I really had kind of understood, where in the past I sort of thought, play the move queen b6 because the book says so. I didn't think about, well, why does the move actually work? The difference with this Tom is that I actually did understand why this move works, realizing that if white does take the pawn, which is what happened in the game, by the way, then, well, he actually can't really keep the pawn very conveniently, as it turns out, because of the bishop to b7, I just have a lot of pressure with the bishops, and that was something I started to appreciate more after working more with Rogers. Yeah, actually, it's one thing I kind of realized that this video, you probably realize it's going to be quite a long one. I think this is not an issue whatsoever, though. Obviously, if you are a chess expert and you're going for this, candidate master title, national master, or FIDE master title, well, I think you want to know my journey, like, just the warts and all, and not to have me, let's say, just show you, like, the success story, but, to see the struggles and how I overcame them as well, yeah? So after takes, I mean, I remember that this game, like, my opponent just played very solidly, to be honest. I mean, probably I'm a little bit better if I play correctly. Like, I think I did miss some opportunities at some moment. Like, for example, queen a3 he played is maybe a little bit sort of weird looking, but okay, I mean, he didn't make any big mistakes either, and somehow, even though I did eventually manage to get an endgame, saying, okay, I'm going to try and use my, yeah, actually, it's sort of an interesting point, because I'd studied the endgame tactics, but I didn't really have that deep of an understanding of, like, the endgames on a more practical kind of level, and, well, it was something I kind of realized at the time from playing online Blitz. I noticed that my main weakness, like, if I was, say, because when I was playing Blitz online in 2007, I improved really, really fast, and by, let's say, September/October 2007, like, I was already playing Blitz basically at a 2500-ish Grandmaster level. But the one sort of area where the kind of the IMs and GMs were outplaying me quite a lot was in the end game. Like, they were just much stronger in this area. And often a lot of it just comes down to practice. Like, just playing a lot of end games is quite simply one of the best ways to improve it. At that time, I didn't have that experience, and so I didn't realize that instead of rook d5, which, okay, it still keeps a big advantage, but I made some other mistakes and missed the win. What I didn't really appreciate in time was how important it is to play g5 in this kind of position. I think the reason I rejected is I thought, well, bishop here, and he just undoubles the pawns, and, I don't want him to undouble the pawns. And what I didn't appreciate is that, actually, in a weird way, you almost want white to play f4. Okay, this is an exaggeration, but the point I mean is that after d3, he's actually not in time to bring his king to e4 to take the pawn. And after something like f4, I can go king h7. Okay, now it's really obvious to me because I'm a grandmaster, but it wasn't obvious back then. I'm pretty sure Ian mentioned a similar point as well in our lesson, that, after something like take, yeah, I mean, you trade the pawn, but so what? I'm just going to go king g6. And we kind of see the problem that white has several weaknesses in this kind of position after king f5 and rook d5. Not just the e5 pawn's a weakness, but also the pass pawn is itself a weakness for him as well, because he has to blockade with the rook, and of course rooks belong behind pass pawns, so my rooks have the position over his in that sense, yes or yes. And indeed, after giving Stockfish the cattle prod, it also confirms that after rook e1 that, well, the winning plan can be something like rook d4 and just bring the bishop to b4 to break the blockade. And, well, if they play a move like a3, well, you see that after a5 that also the b2 pawn is a weakness. So, you know, maybe I can bring the bishop around to hit the rook, bring this rook around, and you're going to see basically that white just can't defend all these weaknesses at once. It's just too much, yeah? So that was an instructive point where I actually did miss the win, and it goes to show that while this was a breakthrough tournament, the first half I did feel like I was not performing to my true potential. Kind of an interesting point when I'm probably still performing at, let's say, 200-300-ish in this first half of the event. But it was the second half where really I got to have the massive breakthrough as such, where I was really able to, what's the way to say it, to basically like have these really great results where I could suddenly beat these much higher rated players, but at the same time be kind of consistent and not have like the other losses, let's say, to the, you know, when I was playing with the black piece Cyber, because you can see that, well, so far I've won all my white games 3 out of 3, but with black I've only scored half out of 3, which is obviously not a, you know, a true indicator of my potential, let's say, and there's a very clear weakness there. But this was the second half was where I started to turn it around. So, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide this video into 2 parts, actually, just so you're able to kind of absorb it and really enjoy the journey. So I'm going to, yeah, you're going to be able to check that out in the next however many days whenever I record the next video. But yeah, I hope that you really enjoyed this one. You know, I assume that since you watched this far, you got a lot out of it. So make sure to smash that like button. Comment below with what was your most valuable insight that you got, what you really loved about this video. And also, it really helps to support the channel if you do subscribe. It's really the easiest way for you to improve your chess, to, you know, get those notifications of my chess grandmaster lessons in your feed. So on that note, I will see you in part 2. Take care, everyone.